This episode is brought to you by Pixel 2 Editions, a full-service fine art printing company. More about them later. Hello and welcome to In the Art Scene podcast, an art podcast that has it all. I'm your host, Galina Marquez, and I invite fascinating people to talk about their personal creative journeys, success stories, and inspiration. We talk about art business and marketing, how to find your creative voice, and all the new trends in the art world like NFT, AI, and such. Join me and my guest for today's conversation. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to In the Art Scene podcast. We are approaching the end of the season, and starting next season, I will have some extra special things prepared for you, but I'm just teasing you. I'll tell you more about this later. But today, I really want to welcome Amy Friend, an amazing photographer from Canada. From what I can see, her work, first of all, her work is amazing. So if you go to her website, amyfriend.ca, you will see all kinds of amazing photography. She's working with cyanotypes. Is that correct as well?
Sometimes I have, yes,
Sometimes.
different processes across the board. So there's a mixture of digital and analog practices.
And I can tell you that Amy made it with her work all over the place. She was featured in I don't know how many countries, but everywhere in Europe, in Asia, in Americas. What was the that will be okay. That will be my question during the interview. What was the most unusual place where your artwork was featured? But first of all, I want to welcome you to the podcast. Thank you for being in the art scene. And please introduce yourself in your own words, because that's the best I can do. I'm sure, well, no one can do it better than you are.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be able to be invited to speak about my work. So I am an artist from Canada. I'm living in St. Catharines, just outside of Toronto. I was originally educated as, or started my education, I should say, painting. And once I took a darkroom course, I was hooked and immediately switched gears. And it held my interest ever since. So that's a little kind of tiny bit about my beginnings. But I've been a practicing artist for about 15 years. And, it started off slow and steady and just plugging away at things for a while. And now I work on that. And I also teach at the university level in a fine arts program as well. So it's a gift. I get it. I get to practice art and teach art. So it's really wonderful.
Yeah, it is wonderful. It sounds really awesome. So you get to enjoy your craft on all kinds of levels. And I'm sure your students love you too.
We have a lot of fun. We do. Yes. I enjoy the classroom, and I find it very refreshing to see people engaging with the arts and studying and putting themselves into that kind of creative world. It's really, I think it's inspiring. As you kind of move out of school, you tend to work on your own a lot. So it's interesting to see where you were and the differences in the way that you make work, you learn about things, you change over time. So it's an interesting perspective. It's like looking into the past, but not really.
Well, it's actually a very interesting perspective. So your students, they learn and they work probably a little bit differently than what you did when you were in the university, right? So the learning process is probably changing as well as arts and technology is evolving.
I think so. I think in some ways there's threads that are similar, but I also think education has that the pace and the expectation of some of what we do in the university, I think has been shaped by technology, what's at our fingertips. And I'm constantly trying to push against the fast pace of learning. I think education shouldn't be a treadmill. And I feel like we often have the education system shaped to produce rather than learn and invest and think. And there is learning in the production, of course, but I think we need to slow down and give students time with material. And I don't think technology always helps us, especially the immediacy of the internet. And I say that as if it's something new, but it's, I think it just snowballs into faster and faster and more, and information is always there. And I think sometimes it's nice to not know the answers immediately. Not that the internet can always give you that, but I think there's differences, many differences.
Yeah, I really like the way you said, because I think you're right that, and the course and curriculum kind of has its time limit, right? So you kind of have to pack a lot of information in whatever space and time is given to you and your students, right? But at the same time, letting them, dive deeper into the exploration of something, or like one of the mediums in particular, is not always feasible. But speaking of that, you said that you were hooked on the darkroom process. So
Yes.
are you still doing it? Are you still doing the analog photography?
I do, although since I had my daughter 9 years ago now, being in the darkroom, there was a lot of limitations with time, and it was easier for me to work at home. So I sort of switched gears, where I would work with analog images that I didn't necessarily produce myself. Working with found and vintage imagery, and then moving along to other projects. But for a while, I was working in that regard, basically just trying to work with what I had at my disposal. And I do, I'm lucky that there is a dark room where actually at the university where I work, it's a brand new well, it's not brand new anymore, but it's a few years old. So it seems brand new compared to many dark rooms that have been around for, generations. And so I do have that at my fingertips, and I've been starting to get into it more and more as my daughter ages and is more independent. So creativity and motherhood and all of those challenges that kind of get wrapped up in where do we find the time. And so I really needed to find a way to be able to do something that aligned with my interests, in between those moments of being a mom and a teacher and all of the other, and having a life. So the dark room was set aside for a bit. And I think it's interesting because, when you do something that you're really interested in, and it's the hands-on part of photography is really, I think, what is at the heart of what pulled me in. That when I needed to kind of remove myself from the darkroom for a bit, I still found different ways of continuing to be hands-on in a digital world, which was not an intentional approach.
Please talk more about that. I'm really curious. As a newly mom creative, I'm having my own challenges, so I really love exploring that side of. And your daughter is 9, so the majority of your art career you have been a mom, right?
Yeah, I felt like I had a good early start where I felt that I was really moving into a comfortable space with what I knew I wanted to focus on, and of course that shifts and changes over time, but I felt very comfortable, and I really wanted to make sure that I just didn't stop making work. That motherhood is its own thing, and I in a way tried to compartmentalize. That's not possible, at least for me it wasn't. And so I found myself working in the wee hours of the night. So okay, I'm not going to be shooting something that requires a studio set or daylight or a particular time frame, because those needs revolved around something else, which was actually quite interesting when you think about how artists work and when they work, and who are in the history books of art, and predominantly they're men, and so what did they have at their disposal? What freedoms do they have? All these things that were not running through my mind at that time. But as I reflect on it, I do think about, just being able to kind of use what's there and respond to, I was working at night. And so for years I had these, this box of Super 8 film that my mother had shot, and I hadn't seen them for years. So I thought, well, I'm just going to look at them. Like my kids sound asleep in my arms and I'm sitting there watching old Super 8 film. And, I have this little tiny studio in my front room, and there was a mirror, and the film caught the mirror. And then I just, it started ideas spinning, and I ended up projecting these Super 8 films off of this big mirror, and then rephotographing, and it turned into its own body of work. Because in one of the frames, I was pausing the Super 8 projector. There was a frame where I was looking back at my mom while filming me. And so now I was looking in a mirror, looking at myself, but seeing what my mother saw. So it was just,
Oh, wow.
And I had my kid in my arms. Like, it was really, really a strange moment.
Wow.
And so it got me thinking about layers of time and how, the generations of the way we see photographs, if we have them at our disposal, because I'm lucky enough to have a few generations of images where, my husband's from Cuba. He doesn't have generations of images. The photographs weren't readily available or readily produced. And so that kind of demographic of who has that history also was interesting, and who were the people using Super 8 film, right? So there's another demographic. So, it was about looking at these familial moments and the passage of time and place and, your ancestry. And so here I am as this mom now, and I'm that, the next in that kind of lineage. And so, we have these little tiny, legacies might be a bit of a grand word, but I'm going to use it anyways, because I think everyone has their little legacy. And the work starts to take form, I think, without even really knowing what you're going to do. Someone told me something really funny once, which was, you'll get the most amount of work done in the 10 minutes you hear your kid wake up, from their nap. And so you think, okay, I've got an hour.
That's
and
true,
then you hear them and you're like, oh my God, they're going to be awake soon. So you just run around and get all this stuff done. And I think if you translate that to the kind of creative act, I used to really take my time and not worry about getting something done per se. So I'm going completely the opposite of what I was talking about when I was talking about teaching, is digging into material. And a lot of the time I just need to do something so that I know I'm getting something started. And so it was a bit of forcing my process to change for me in an uncomfortable way. But in the end, you just do it. You just keep doing that. I don't actually often talk about being a mother and an artist. So it's kind of interesting that I am now. I usually mention it and then I move along like, this is the work I make. But maybe because she insisted on being in the same room with me with her headphones on right now.
What's her name?
Her presence is felt.
Oh, hi, Emmy's daughter. Hi.
Yeah, she's not hearing a whole lot. Can you say hi, Isabel?
Hi.
Perfect. That's it.
Oh, that's the first time. That's the first time we have a cameo.
Oh, a cameo. There you are. Okay.
Hi, Isabel. Yeah. Hi. How are you doing?
Good. Is she at the beach?
Well, her backdrop looks like she's at the beach. So this is the magic of tuning in via video. We can pretend like we're somewhere we're not.
Yes, I'm totally pretending.
She's like, okay, bye. Okay, Isabel, can you put your headphones back on so we can record quietly?
She's adorable. She's adorable. Yeah, it's a rare rainy day in San Diego, so I'm pretending that I'm at the beach and the weather is fine. So,
well, we had a little snow this morning, so there you are. It's raining now. Yes, the snow has turned to rain, which is fine with me. Right. So that work was probably the first series that I made, at home, not really knowing what I was going to do. And it did turn into a larger body of work. And it was really about kind of the materials that start to surround us. And so I've, become this collector of familial items, photos. Whenever my family's getting rid of something, they would say, "Do you want the Super 8 film we're going to get?" I'm like, "Yeah, of course I want it." And so exploring what those materials mean when there's nobody there to speak for them, what do they really mean, anything other than, almost this kind of like scientific exploration of like, what are these materials? What do they say about us? And when you're not connected to anyone in those, those films or in those images, do they have a resonance with other people? And so I was exploring some of those ideas, but also the stories that, that I heard as a kid that became a part of my understanding of family and my own history.
I gotta ask you the question.
Yes.
What is Super 8 film? Like, I know nothing about photography.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Super 8 film was one of, the earlier types of film, moving film. I would say it was probably from the for my mother, at least, she was shooting around the 1960s. And right up until, I would say, the 80s is when maybe it phased out for our use anyways, probably even a little bit earlier than that. And so it was basically like early video recording. Now we record everything on our cameras, but then it was quite unique to, have the Super 8 film. A lot of families did. And again, this is why I say a demographic's important, right? Middle-class family who can afford this kind of novelty new film. And I mean, people did shoot Super 8 film, 16 mil film, in, to make movies, but early on, when it became more mainstream, it's what my mother would always have it, but it's interesting because there's no sound, right? So you just get the imagery and there's a beauty to it. Like I started breaking the film down into these segments because there's so many frames equals a second of time. And so I often revisit projects that I've done in the past. And so I ended up exhibiting this work again, actually just this year. And it was in a much larger exhibition. And so I was going back at some of the ideas that I had written down, but I, moved on because I had other things I wanted to explore. And then I started breaking the Super 8 film up into these seconds. And so it looks like nothing's happening in these little tiny frames. I have one actually right here. I know they can't see it when we're recording, but it's tiny. Like it
is tiny.
Little strip of film. And so, 18 frames is that's about it. And that's a second of time. But in that 1 second, nothing really looks like it's moving, but it is. And so I found something interesting about, that idea of photography and movement, and the idea of freezing motion. And yet to the naked eye, it doesn't seem like there's any motion happening. But once it moves across a light and it's pulled, all of a sudden motion becomes animated. So it's interesting.
It is interesting. And you know what it reminds me of? You're talking and I'm recalling there was an exhibition many years ago back in Moscow when I still was living there. They brought Andy Warhol exhibition, but it was not paintings or photography. It was like short, like literally a second or a couple of seconds films put on the loop.
Mm-hmm.
And those were like portraits of people, like Dali and Picasso and you name it. So lots of very famous black and white like images of very famous people, and they would just sit on the rotating stool and kind of turn and then turn and then turn, or someone was brushing the teeth and it was on the loop, and so it was all projected on a pretty big screen. So you were in the room and you have this humongous moving portraits of those people around you. It was really interesting. I'm like personally, not a big fan of Andy Warhol per se, but that work was really, really interesting. So when you were talking about how much movement is locked in this 18 frames in a small segment of the film, and it's 1 second, and like there's almost no movement, but there is. It kind of reminded me of that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, very.
So that has become your body of work. Was it like you were still doing a photography with that film? So the film is a video, but you were projecting it and photographing it. So your work was kind of, the photographic work. Is that right?
Yeah, so I photographed the reflective film off of the mirrors, and then I made prints of that. So it was in a way making still, a moment that doesn't even exist anymore. Whereas a photograph is trying, typically would capture something from real life and freeze it. So I was freezing something that had already been captured. So a lot of the time when I'm working, I love referencing the medium itself, referencing photography and how it operates because of what it actually is. That there's, it indicates so much related to time, to the past, to that moment. And sometimes that can be and feel really cliche, but there's I find it really interesting to keep digging and kind of poking at it, and even poking at the mechanism itself, this idea of, a mirror, and the camera has the mirror, and the pristine quality of the photograph is always been something that I've been interested in, kind of not destroying per se, although although I do exactly do that in some of my work, but questioning, why imagery, why a photo needs this kind of perfect, it's that perfectly focused, perfectly printed, pristine. And I think it comes down to, at least to me, is thinking about early photography was so precious. And so, have we reached a point with the digital world where photographs are no longer precious at all? Although they really are. I mean, the amount of like filters we have just to edit so that we look like perfect humans, says something about the preciousness of imagery, but not of the touch, not of that kind of physical quality to a photograph. So that's always been something that interests me. And I think that kind of circles back to the practice in the darkroom and the analog type of and historic processes.
I have to apologize to everybody if you can hear the noise. This is the rain. It's like I'm sitting in my studio in the garage, and unfortunately I can hear everything. I don't know if you can hear it if microphone picks it up, but anyway, I'm sorry. So getting back to your comment, it is very interesting that you mentioned how precious the imagery was and is, and it I think it is very interesting nowadays that we have like hundreds and thousands of photos of every day in our like phones and in our pockets. So in the way, you're kind of like the value of it disappears, and we're not printing them anymore. So we don't keep. I remember. So my mom was making. How do you like? How do you call that film? Unfortunately, I don't know the English name for that. When you have a film and then you need to slide it in the projector, and it kind of slides to the next
Oh
one,
yeah.
and then the slides, right?
Slides.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay. So that
you got it.
so it's the same order. All right. So she was doing that, and I know that somewhere she has like 5 shoe boxes full of those slides, and
Mhm.
a old projector, which I'm not even sure if it's working anymore. But she was cherished, like she spent time, and she put a lot of effort into recording my childhood, my sister's childhood. Um, uh, uh, Back then my father was alive, and unfortunately he passed when I was little, so that's practically the only memories that we have. And
Mm.
it was the whole process. The whole family would get together in the living room, and we would put a white sheet over the door and just spend a couple of hours just watching the slides. Who does that anymore?
I know, and I think it's interesting because, for my daughter, I, intended on printing and making sure we have albums for her. And I have a bunch printed, but they're so random. It's there. I need to print some photos. We're going to visit family in Cuba, so I'll print some for us too. And so they're these little pockets of time, but they're not the way that we would normally work. Sorry, she's doing something. Isabel, we need to turn that off, please.
Do that because Grandma's calling.
Okay, Grandma's calling, but can you turn that off, please?
It's Grandma's calling.
My apologies.
It's okay.
I didn't do it.
Okay. Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
how dare I?
I kind of like having a third person in the studio.
Oh goodness, it's like a whole show over here. That's just great.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, and that's, I think for me, you mentioned the slides, and that's what the Super 8 film was like. It was a time where the whole family would get together, and it was really funny because you would laugh at the family's own story, own history, but you would do it collectively as a group. And I find a lot of the time looking at images, it's now very individual. You're scrolling through a phone, or you're looking on a computer. And I mean, there's a million ways to share images. But I feel like even the idea of a photo album, right? An album, people would open the album and, maybe look individually, but often it would be something that would be, get the album out and you would share.
Yeah, and I remember in my childhood we had stacks of albums. They were pretty, they were covered in velvet, so they were really expensive. And then I would sit with my parents and my grandparents, and they would I knew who those people were because I was told all those stories. Right now, you're absolutely right. Like whatever I have in my pocket on my phone, that's about it. I probably don't even my son probably will not know most of the people on those photos that I take with my phone, right? When he grows up. So it is very interesting.
It is. And some of my earlier work, it's actually, I was just found out I was going to have Isabel when I started a series called Dare alla luce. And that's, it literally is a translation from Italian, referencing childbirth. And I didn't know that I was going to be having a kid when I chose the title. So it was really, maybe serendipitous is the word, I'm not sure, but it means to bring to the light, and it's a reference to childbirth. But what I was doing was thinking about the way that I had shared photo albums with my Nona, my grandmother, and she had started to kind of forget some of the details. And I was really reflecting on, what does a photograph really mean when there's nobody there to speak of it? And I can't remember who said it, but, it was, a photograph, a person dies twice, once when they die, and then another time when nobody can,
remember
identify
them
or speak their name.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking that I had just, graduated from school. So I was full of all of the readings I had done. And, but I was really interested in this, these moments of sharing and talking and learning. And of course, the change in maybe what the original real, if there is a real story to a photograph, versus the next telling of it and the next. And so, that history shifts and changes, and knowledge of yourself, your history shifts and changes. And so I started collecting anonymous photographs off of eBay. And that's when I started thinking about, what am I going to do with these images? I wanted to make them special somehow, and yet I had no connection to them. And so I started initially embroidering on them, thinking if I make them into these ornate objects, and maybe they'll be valued differently or looked at longer or touched, even that sense of tactile quality. And I was doing it. I did a few of them, and I was like, okay, this is okay. And then it just didn't quite feel right. There's that moment where you're doing something, you're like, this isn't right. And I was watching my husband play baseball, which is not my favorite thing to do, although, it's fine. And I was, doing my thing, the crazy woman in the stands sewing her photographs. And I had poked some holes in this image to sew through, and I held it up to the light, and the light came through. And I was like, oh, I don't need to sew these. The light is perfect. So I started working on just poking the holes through the image and letting the light come through. It's like that reinvention of the photograph, rather than trying to make it special. It's almost, alluding to the fact that this is something nobody cares about. And what I loved about it is people would say, well, you destroyed those photos. And I thinking, well, someone just ripped them out of an album
Yeah.
and threw them on eBay for a few bucks. Like, why do they matter now? And again, it comes to that preciousness of where do we place the,
Yeah.
importance or value. And I worked on that series for quite a long time. Particularly, again, it was at a time when Isabel, my daughter, was, a newborn, and it allowed me to, sit and look through the internet and find imagery that I was, compelled to want to work with. And sometimes the images I chose reminded me of stories from, my childhood that we didn't have photographs of. Other time, there was just an inscription that, made me want to work with an image. There's a really beautiful one. It's a little girl dancing, and it says something like our dancing girl, Evelyn, age 9. And it's like just a sweet sentiment. And it's quite an old photograph. It's probably from the early 1900s. And you can tell in the background that it's not, an elaborate, wealthy yard that the child is in, but she has this kind of wonderful, I would guess, an Art Deco-ish costume on. And so there's another one that I worked with called just Ruth. I think it was 1939. And Ruth is shooting a gun somewhere in the woods, or pretending to, or I'm not sure. But we don't know what country she's from. We don't know anything other than Ruth and time frame. And so the provenance is lost. There's all these interesting hints or possibilities. And I found that really kind of fascinating as I continued to work on the series.
Yeah, it is really interesting. Hey, In the Arts Scene listeners, do you remember Mark O'Donnell from Pixel 2 Editions? He's been on the show in Season 3, Episode 7, and told us everything we need to know about giclée printing. And take my word for it, Mark and his team are the best in Southern California and beyond. I've been a client of Pixel 2 Editions since 2019, and I've been shouting about them from the rooftops ever since. Luckily, I don't have to do it anymore because I have a podcast. Despite being San Diego local, Mark and his team are working with some of the best photographers and artists from all states, including Clark Little and Kadir Nelson. And frankly, if you are a photographer or a digital artist, you don't need to be local to work with Pixel 2 Editions. Just use a file upload on their website for your heavy images and write down the specs. They can print small proofs for you on any substrate you want and ship them to you for free. And for my listeners, they offer a free 8x10 full image proof on metal. Just tell them that you heard about them on the podcast and they will take care of you. Let me tell you, their metal prints are amazing. Whenever I order mine, they fly off the shelves in no time. So I highly recommend you try it out. And oh, did I mention that they are a full service company? It means that they do everything from color correcting and printing to framing and shipping directly to you or your clients. So don't wait, go to pixel2editions.com, 2 is a number, and editions is plural, or call 858-549-7299. Again, pixel2editions.com, 2 is a number, and editions is plural, or call 858-549-7299. Say hi for me. I wanted to get back a little bit to your comment about people's commenting on you ruining the photographs. This is so common with artists, and I've had artists on this podcast who were painting on like old vinyl records or working with books. And that's the same kind of thing, like, oh, you're ruining the records. Like, well, the record is already ruined. I mean, I'm not taking something that is, that it has, historical value and probably already scratched. You can't even play it. So I'm just giving it a new life. Or with books, the same thing. We are taught to value books, and I know it for myself because I grew up around books. My mom was her entire life working in publishing companies, so books were something that was really, really precious because I saw her making, like, she was making some she was binding some books at home just for fun, and I saw her doing it, and it was like a very elaborate process and a very heavy press, and all of that stuff. I was like, yeah, well, how can anyone destroy this? But if it's some sort of a outdated kind of a cheap book that no one can use anymore and it's going to landfill anyway, why not giving it a new life, right? So it's a very interesting comment from people who are maybe not like putting some extra thought into what artist is doing.
Yeah, and I enjoy the debate because I think it does bring
Yeah.
up the question of, well, what do we really do with our images after so long?
Yeah.
Like, what do they, where is the meaning held? And so I find that for me in this particular circumstance, the debate and the comments are, they're a welcomed kind of sideways way of thinking about our relationship to imagery itself. And so, I've had other people like, well, you're not really making art, you're just using other images. Okay, that's also, it's a valid and welcomed discussion, because we all have an approach to how and what we imagine, art making to require.
That's an awesome okay, any
Right. You're
found
not,
object.
I don't have to like it.
Yeah. And in that case, like the found object art is not art. I mean, but it's considered art. And then, it's a different kind of art. Yeah, those discussions are really interesting. I had a question. So on your website, I was reading about what your research is, and you were talking a lot about the memories and the meaning of the images and how we relate to them. But there was something else on your website that says land memory. So what is land memory and how that informs your work?
I think the idea of our connection to the earth itself, to the universe, to, where do we divide our experience versus nature? And so I think there's a memory there that's deeper than that's my mom calling again. He's hearing me talk about land memory.
Well,
it's
bring
funny,
her
actually, because one of the projects that I did with I don't know where my phone is, turn that off. One of the projects that I did was I had my mother, who's now calling me again. We had this house that my grandparents lived in, and we farmed, and it was a small farm. It was like a little family farm. But we would work that land together. And as, they passed on in their lives and my mom still had the house, it, was overgrown with these little clovers. And at night, when night would fall, they look like stars. And I'm a little bit obsessed with stars. If you look at my work online, you'll see, she's really into the stars, or dust or dirt, and these ways that are both light and dark. These kind of oppositional things are a big part of my work. But I was interested in the connection to the land, and more in the sense of, what does it mean to be digging your hands into this land, literally the memory of that land, it, rather than us remembering it, even though that's a part of it, but, how does it remember us? How do we become a part of its memory? And so I think, when we think of living and breathing, we often stop at, because I'm generalizing, this kind of human place. And so I like to turn it around. But I had my mother, I said, Mom, like, look at this field, these little white clovers are all over, and it looked like starlighted kind of, landed on the field. And so sky and land were reversed. Would you mind going out there and just laying in the land? And then I said, and nude. And she's like, oh, sure, I can do that. So she did. And she fell asleep. So I'm like yelling, you can get up now. And she's not moving. I'm thinking, uh-oh, this is not good. And I still, to this day, don't know how she could have stayed there for so long, because I was losing my mind with the mosquitoes and she was asleep. She's like, I've never done that before. It was so but she was so at home in that place. And so I did this series where I had photographed some of my family in these different locations, because we had spent so much time in these places. And then thinking about, my husband being from Cuba, and he would often talk about the smell of the earth, and even the way your foot felt under the places you grew up, right? And he's always taking his shoes off and walking on the grass. He's just like, I want to feel connected. And so I think that's what it really plays with, is who remembers what, and the who is universal rather than individual human.
Yeah, and I feel like if your mom calls again, you just need to pick it up and bring her in.
You're driving us crazy here, but we're gonna bring you on.
That would be awesome. Oh, I'm so, like, it's so awesome to listen to you like talking about how you get your entire family, like generations of the family, involved in your work, like passively or actively. It's awesome.
Really cool. I always joke that when you grow up in an Italian household, they kind of cancel out any other ancestry you might ever have had. They're like, Scottish? No, there's no Scottish in here. You're Italian, right? Like they just, they're very, they're very active in their stories and in their connection. Not that other, cultures aren't by any means, but my family was particularly robust in the way that they, connected and held on to where they came from and the stories. We all kind of grew up on this one street, and so there was a lot of family around. And so I think for that reason, the storytelling, the history, even the magic of the way I grew up in some ways, I think played a role into obviously where my interests are. But my grandfather was this kind of interesting character who built a roundhouse because, when he left Italy, he saw castles and wanted to build a castle when he came to Canada. So I grew up in this roundhouse as a kid, which was just a wonderful, wacky, weird house.
That's really cool.
And so those stories, they become embedded in, a big part of who you are. And then I think that, as a kid growing up, connected to the land that way, and I was always close to the water. And, if my work online, there's always water featured substantially in many different projects. Even right now, we're just 2 blocks from Lake Ontario. So it's always been very present. And it's funny because when I ended up marrying my husband, I was like, oh, tell me you're from the coast. And he's like literally landlocked in the middle of Cuba. And I'm like, oh, come on, right near the beach. But we've been, I've been working with the water now in my latest work. Been collecting seawater and using it and soaking my photos in it and letting the seawater dehydrate. And then on the surface of the images is the kind of remnants of the salt, which leaves this kind of celestial. So there we go back again to the stars, celestial type of visual, I guess is the best way of putting it.
Wow, that's interesting. Like you're talking about these processes, and I have interviewed a few photographers. And I am like, my cup is absolutely empty. I know nothing about photography except for what I have in my pocket, obviously. And like every single time when I'm talking to someone, especially when it's about the processes, I'm like, how much more can you do with the photography? I mean, there's like this, it seems like the sky is the limit. I just thought that, there's a digital and there's a dark room and that's about it. You just choose the image, kind of create the composition, but apparently again, there's the sky is the limit. And I really love how you're building an enormous legacy for your family with this work. I mean, it's not necessarily, the photo album that the family will be sitting and looking through, like, I don't know, down the generations, but it's an amazing work with lots of thoughts that will probably relate to many other families, and the stories are attached to it. already, and I really love. Yeah, back to your earlier comment about little legacies that we all are leaving behind. Yeah,
Yeah, the little notes. I think that's important is, getting
yeah,
trying to get people to think about if you only had 10 photos in your, the album that you print from your giant, thousands of images you shoot every day, which 10 would you choose and what would you write on the back of those images? Because I think that, there are images, historic images that stand out for, different people for different reasons. And they become images that are important in your life. But what about the familial images that become, if there are any, become those images that you hold on to really dearly, or they were just always there, so then they're a part of that memory record that you have of, this is an important image in my family, even though it was chosen for you, it was just
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
always there. So yeah, I find it really interesting the way images find their way to us as well.
Yeah. So, getting back a little bit to your Italian ancestry, have you? And that's a perfect segue to my earlier question that I did not get to ask yet. Have you ever visited Italy, the land of your ancestors, and what was the most unusual place where your work has been displayed?
So I have visited Italy a few times. I've been lucky enough to be able to do that. I was able to go to some of the very small little towns that my grandparents were from, and then of course traveled through other parts of Italy. And it was really important to make the connections and also see, some of the places that were photographed, 100 years later, seeing these images and comparing and seeing similarities in buildings and that kind of reference of photography as a historical artifact was for me, getting all geeky in photography land, but just loving the kind of connections that could be made. The strangest place my photos were shown or most unique. There's a couple places I would say that I really enjoyed seeing my photos out and about. One of them was a photography festival in northern Spain called the Getxo Photography Festival. And my work was kind of tucked into one of the interior exhibitions. But the way that they held the entire exhibition and festival was just there was a bunch of photographers and they would install the work all over the city so people could just randomly come across them or intentionally seek them out. And they had, a walking tour when you could, of course, join in. But I loved the surprise of finding these images in that particular way. And I would say one of the other, I think, really special exhibitions for me was actually in the city I'm living in now, St. Catharines. There was it's now closed, unfortunately, Rodman Hall Art Center. We had an exhibition with actually the images I was telling you about with the Super 8 film, and I made a photograph that was printed on silk, and it was in this old mansion turned into an art gallery. But what made that really special was I had time. So thinking about how quick everything happens, but I had time to think about how I wanted the work to live for a short period of time in that building and respond in a way to the building itself. So I printed this big silk piece, and it's about 40 feet long, but I hung it over the window. And because it was taken from Super 8 film, when the light would come in the window, it would flicker, of course, and model the way light does as it, kind of passes through any natural place. And so it somewhat mimicked the Super 8 film, that kind of fluttering light, but it also, referenced the opulence of this kind of mansion that the curtain was in, the exhibition was in. But the history of why I printed it on silk goes again back to storytelling. And, my grandmother, when they were trying to save money to come to Canada, raised silkworms. And so I was kind of being facetious because this was an image taken from Italy, from the land, and it could have been anywhere, but I imagined that those silkworms were the worms that made that curtain that ended up in Canada. And so playing and being facetious and kind of a bit of a poking at, the labor that we don't see, and really the wealth of some people versus others. And so the location itself became really important to the exhibition. So I would say that that very little place in a little place in Canada was for me very special.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. I really love how you're connecting all those little details to your work and really, really creating a very cohesive, very detailed story that it's not just the image that people are interacting with. There's so much going into this. So yeah, it's really awesome.
It's like layers of wallpaper. You move into a house and you're like,
how
many times how many times did they paint this house?
Yeah. And I live in California now, and wallpaper is not something that is traditionally used in California. But I grew up in Moscow in Russia, where wallpaper was pretty much the only, because you have this concrete buildings, like multi-story buildings, and it's really cold, and wallpaper, like painting those walls really would not do. So people were using wallpaper, and I remember when we were in our apartment, when we were redoing wallpapers, like they were old when I was little. And then we would take them off, and there would be newspaper glued onto the wall, because directly on the concrete, you just can't, like, or the adhesives were not good at that time, or I don't know. So people would cover the walls with newspaper. And it was really interesting because you would just rip the piece of wallpaper, and then there's like a piece of article with the date and something else.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. Interesting.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I feel like we can go on and on and on and on. So maybe I'll bring you back at some point on the podcast that we can talk more about this, because I really enjoy this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and allowing the guest appearances from my family.
That was lovely. I think that was the first time actually that it happened on the podcast. I liked it. Although I'm really sorry that we didn't bring on your mom.
Oh goodness. My mom's probably thinking, you told them I did that in the backfield. Oh goodness.
Well, sorry, Mom, it's public now.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more about my work, and it was lovely to chat. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your time as well, and thank you for sharing with us. And please let everybody know how to find you. I will for sure leave all the links in the show notes. So, and I saw that there's a link on your Instagram to some like current article. So I will, whatever will be current on your Instagram, I will make sure to include it into the show notes when this episode goes live as well. Super. But yeah, just tell us how to find you.
Yeah, so the easiest is my website, www.amyfriend.ca. And then I use actually my grandmother's maiden name, because I have the odd last name of Friend, which is Scottish, by the way. I wasn't joking about the Scottish, but I use Amy Querin for my Instagram. It's AMYQUERIN, because the internet's an interesting world, and you get a lot of strange stuff with a name like Friend. So use Querin instead.
It's awesome. Well, thank you, Amy. That was really awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for being a part of the art scene and making it richer and more interesting. And I will see you again in the art scene. It has been another episode of In the Art Scene podcast. If you liked today's conversation, please give us a good review on Apple and go listen to other great stories. Check out our website intheartscene.com or follow us on Instagram at intheartscene for more content. If you are a creative and you want to share your story, shoot us a message from the website or DM us on Instagram. Look forward to seeing you next time in the art scene.